everyone, and welcome down to episode number 130 of the Down South Photo Show with me, Brendan Waits, here in Ocean Grove, Victoria, Australia. And the dude that's normally on your other screen or in your other ear, well, he's off on holidays, some highfalutin trip somewhere, like he does. These photographers that make all this money, I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, welcome down to a fresh episode, a very special episode of the Down South Photo Show, because I have a special guest who I'm going to introduce shortly to you. But bit of housekeeping first. Thank you to everyone who's liked, subscribed, follow the channel, all that kind of stuff. All 855 of you on YouTube and all 14 trillion of you who listen to us religiously on the podcast, on Australia's #1 ranked photography podcast. Real quick, we just want to say that the voting for the People's Choice for our winter competition is done and dusted. Cam and I will announce the winner of the People's Choice Award next week on the show when he bothers to get back into Australia, but we'll get there. I'm sure we'll get there. So keep an ear out for that. I want to give a quick shout out to Eric, who was actually the comp winner of the winter winter Facebook competition, who popped into the shop into Ocean Grove Camera and Photo during the week. So I said I'd give him a shout out. So there's a shout out for you, Eric. Without any further ado, this is an interview that I've just recorded with Rudy, who is based in France. How apt, given that the Olympic Games are in full swing in Paris. It was a great chat that I had with Rudy, and Rudy is very, very into his Astro photography, which is, as you can see by my background, if that didn't give it away already. So sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 130 of the Down South Photo Show with Rudy Astro. Cheers. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome down to a very special episode of the Down South Photo Show. Today, we are having a chat with a young fella all the way on the other side of the world in France. It is Rudy. Hello, Rudy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Brendan?
What do I call? Do I call you Rudy Astro?
Rudy's fine. Rudy Astro is just on my Instagram name.
It is.
So,
So
yeah,
I've
either way.
brought Rudy onto the channel because Rudy, I know Rudy quite well. I've known Rudy for pretty much all his life. I've met Rudy a couple of times I met him once over in France. We were just saying off air, it was 5 years ago already. So you were 12 when I saw you last time, Rudy.
Yeah, I was a little boy.
You were. You're not much bigger now, mate.
No.
But it is good to have you on board. So Rudy is an astrophotographer, but more than just astro, he actually is into deep space photography, which I'm absolutely fascinated by. And I know a lot of our listeners will be pretty keen to see how you go about things. And to kick things off, it's actually, if I cover up myself, there's my background right there, which Rudy is going to tell us all about. So this kind of photography, which absolutely blows my mind that you're able to get shots like that. So Rudy, if you'd like to just briefly introduce yourself and say who you are, where you live, that sort of stuff, that would be great. So we'll kick off with you. So where do you live, Rudy?
Okay, so I live in France, specifically the French Alps, which have some pretty dark skies and pretty high altitude as well, which is quite suitable for deep sky astrophotography.
Right. So altitude definitely helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the higher you go in altitude, basically there's just less atmosphere between you and the sky. And so it's, yeah, that's definitely a help.
Yeah, fantastic. So how old are you, Rudy?
I'm 17, turning 18 in October.
Fantastic, because it might surprise a lot of people that just how young you are to produce such amazing photos. So before we came on air, I've actually put a few photos up for people to have a look at. So it blows my mind that that someone so young is able to produce such amazing images literally from your backyard. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all my photos basically are taken from the garden. So I do a few usually like Milky Way shots. Sometimes I'll go up in the mountains where there's less light pollution and stuff. But with the telescope, it's fine. I can just do it from the garden basically.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So before you got into, do we call it deep space photography or astrophotography? What do we call it?
Yeah, well, astrophotography is sort of like the umbrella term that covers everything from Milky Way to aurora shots to telescope. And yeah, deep sky photography would specifically be objects in deep space like galaxies, nebulae, stuff like that.
So before you got into this kind of photography, were you keen on photography beforehand?
Not really. This was sort of my first kind of entry into the hobby actually, because I got my first camera. I brought it here.
Fantastic.
I bought that specifically for doing astrophotography with, and I actually kind of, picked up regular photography, like landscape photography on the side. But yeah, that was kind of my first entry into it. So
So it
pretty
was it
sort
was a
of
telescope before it was a camera, yeah?
exactly, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
It was a visual telescope, which you can't see. I've got it in the corner over there.
Yep.
But yeah, I started out basically taking pictures with my phone through the eyepiece. So
With your phone.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I had so when we got this telescope, my dad sort of bought it for Christmas about 3 years ago at this point. And I wanted to take pictures of the moon, and that's sort of the only thing you can really do with a phone through the eyepiece of the camera because it's so bright. And so
Yep.
yeah, I bought a little kind of smartphone adapter and just put it on, took pictures of the moon. That's how I
And that's
started.
what sort of gave you the bug, yeah?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So when we're
Mhm.
talking about your photos, and we'll go through a few of your shots a little later on, and
Mhm.
this is a big generalization. You know,
Yeah.
how far away are your subjects that you're trying to photograph?
Yeah. So obviously it ranges a lot, but generally a few hundred to a few million light years away. So that one you've got behind you there, that's the Andromeda Galaxy. So that's about a million light years away. That's one of the more distant objects we can see.
Yeah,
And but some of them, like star clusters and things, the Pleiades star cluster, which I don't know if we're going to talk about that one, but
we will be.
it's only sort of 400 light years away, so it does
Only.
vary quite a bit. Yeah, only
Yeah, yeah. And
relatively
this is
speaking.
why I'm laughing so much because
Yeah,
as a landscape photographer, we talk a lot on the show about using big zoom lenses and things like that to
yeah,
reach into a scene, but we're talking 3 or 4 kilometers.
yeah. A few miles.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it absolutely blows my mind when you talk about things that are, literally a light year, let alone a million light years
yeah,
away. So absolutely
yeah.
fantastic. So did you find yourself sort of when you got into putting a camera onto your
Hmm.
telescope, what was the first camera that you attached to a telescope, like other than your phone?
Yeah. So I bought this Nikon D5600 here. I've had this for about two, actually coming up on 3 years. I think that telescope was more like 4 years ago now that I think
Yep,
about it. But
yep.
yeah, just bog standard Nikon D5600, and I basically just kind of take the lens off and you sort of put a T adapter on it, and then you just slide it right into the scope essentially.
Yeah, oh, okay. So basically the
Yeah,
telescope becomes the lens.
exactly. Yeah, that's that's
Yep.
that's pretty much how it works. It's called prime focus astrophotography as opposed to um because some people like basically go through the eye like with a smartphone essentially. That would not be prime focus photography then because you've got an
Yeah.
extra element in front of
Okay. All right.
it.
So
Yeah.
when you first started dabbling, where did you get your information from to be able to do it? Were you just YouTubing and Googling and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it was mostly YouTube, I think. There's a few good channels I watched that are pretty tailored to sort of beginner astrophotography, and I just read up on it and stuff. I never, I never really met anyone in real life who does the same thing. So
Yeah. Right.
yeah,
So it's
all my
it's a fairly
information came from
niche
online.
it's a fairly niche
Yeah,
sort of area of photography, so I'm not
yeah, yeah,
surprised.
absolutely.
Do you know of any
Yeah.
other people in your area that do it?
No, I actually haven't, to this day, I haven't met a single other person who does astrophotography. So yeah, I thought I would because I thought like, by going out and buying used gear and meeting up with people, I'd end up finding someone, but that hasn't happened yet. So yeah,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
this day, I'm the
Yeah,
only one
that's
in the valley so far, to my knowledge.
so the actual telescope itself, and what I'll do is I'll put it on the screen later on for people to see
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
The brand of is there a particular brand that's good, or
Um,
if you were talking to someone who wanted to get into this, first of all,
yeah.
what should they be looking for? What type of telescope? And perhaps even budget wise, what would they be looking at to get into a setup to get a shot of the Andromeda Galaxy, for example?
Yeah, okay. So, well, first of all, it's worth noting. So the telescope I'm running now for my astrophotography is not the same as the first scope I got a few years ago. So
Right.
that's known as a Dobsonian telescope. So
Yep.
it's like a Newtonian tube with a mirror, and it's on a fairly sort of simple alt azimuth wooden base, which basically just means like up, down, left, right. So it's very easy to sort of control manually.
Right.
Um, so that
So
would
that was the one
be
you were using to shoot the moon.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's
Right.
the one I
Gotcha.
had my phone on and everything.
Gotcha.
So that's generally the kind of telescope that's recommended for beginners, just because it's like, pure simplicity of use essentially. And
Yep.
you also get they're pretty cheap, like for the aperture for the size that you get, essentially. They're the kind of cheapest construction.
Yep.
So yeah, but the only thing is they're not really sort of suited to astrophotography. They're more kind of visual with the eyepiece. So
Right.
yeah, taking pictures of the moon with your phone is sort of the best you can get out of that kind of scope,
Okay.
essentially.
So then
Yeah,
you worked out very quickly for you to get into more deep space stuff. You needed to upgrade and get something
yeah,
a little bit more
yeah, yeah.
serious. So what are we talking about there?
Yeah, so one big thing you miss out on with a Dobsonian when it comes to astrophotography is that there's no tracking on it, so you can't do long exposures basically because there's no way. I mean, you can't stand there and manually kind of track it at that focal length. It just doesn't work. So
Yeah, of course.
so yeah, quickly I realized I needed some kind of tracking to get into it, and that was kind of the biggest hurdle at the beginning because I was like what 14 or something. I didn't have a job or anything, so I was
Yeah.
like, damn, these trackers cost like 400 euros minimum. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I've got I'll just get it down. I've got this thing here, which is a small kind of star tracker. So that was the
Yep.
first tracking mount I got. And that was I sort of made a mistake with this one because I thought if I get that and a kind of smallish telescope, I went for a refractor telescope essentially, which is very similar to a camera lens in design. It basically is a lens,
Yep.
um, like a telephoto lens. And I thought I could get away with kind of putting that on the mini tracker and my camera and tracking it. And it worked to some extent, but it was a bit too heavy and a bit too zoomy, I guess.
Okay.
And the tracking wasn't very good. So this kind of thing's more suited to like just a camera and a lens like this, a kind of more wide angle setup.
Right.
Yeah, that was the next kind of piece of equipment I got, basically.
Yeah, it sounds like it's I mean clearly it's equipment heavy, so yeah, there's a bit of
Yeah,
investment involved if you want to go chasing
yeah,
this sort of stuff. So
absolutely.
you're saying the tracker you just showed me, it would be better for
Hmm.
if you're shooting like Milky Way, wider angle stuff.
Exactly.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. So that that's kind of like the first logical step one would make into astrophotography after just a camera and a tripod. Um, for doing wide angle Milky Way stuff. So
Yep.
you can sort of put telephoto lenses on this to some extent, but just you can't really push it like I did because you just get all the stars start trailing and stuff, and the tracking's
Of
not very
course.
accurate. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
So then once you progressed onto, I'm assuming it's a bigger telescope that you needed, or
Hmm.
is it just a
Um,
different kind? Is it more a reflector
yeah,
telescope?
different types. So the one I'm currently the one I had originally was a reflector
Yep.
on a Dobsonian base. Um, and that one was actually far too big for my needs. Generally, one would start out with a much smaller scope. But like I said, it's really the tracking that makes the difference. And
Yep.
so, and when you start out with a tracker or an equatorial mount, as we like to call them, you generally want to start out with a smaller telescope because it's just way more forgiving in terms of tracking errors and precision and stuff. So, yeah, I don't have the scope with me right now. It's actually outside, but
Yeah.
it is a lot smaller in physical size than
No,
the
that's all right.
than the
I'll
reflector
put
telescope.
I'll put a picture of it up on the screen for everyone to
Yeah,
have a
I'm
look
sure
at.
I'm sure you got some photos of it. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's no
that's
problem at
fine.
all. You can
Yeah.
also head over while we're there. If you head over to Rudy's Instagram, which will be linked in the
Mhm.
description as well, you can see he's done some time lapse footage of himself actually doing this kind of photography, which is
Hmm.
fascinating to watch in itself, let alone the
Yeah.
images that it produces. So
Yeah.
how do you decide what you're going to shoot next?
Good question. So I have this program on my computer called Stellarium, which is essentially it's like a virtual planetarium. And so it'll give you a kind of simulation of what the sky is going to look like at any given time from your location.
Oh, that's cool.
And so generally, yeah, it's pretty useful. So I'll generally sort of start out by heading over here, and then I'll just yeah, click around until I find something that is both interesting to shoot and also suitable for the equipment I have.
Okay. And so once you've made your decision and it's all lining up for you, what's the procedure you go through to get the shot?
Well, obviously it starts with, setting up the telescope itself. And so that means, lugging all my equipment downstairs, which
Yep.
is great because it's all pretty heavy,
Yep.
loads of counterweights and stuff. So
Yeah.
I'll take all the equipment outside. I try to do this when it's still light because it's a pain in the ass to
Yep.
do in the
Yeah.
dark,
And
obviously.
and clearly you need a clear night as well.
Yes, yeah, of
Yeah.
course, yeah. So
Yeah.
you don't
Let's
want
start there.
you don't want to set yeah, exactly. There's not much point going out for the card. Yeah, so I'll physically assemble it, and then you got to do a thing called polar alignment, which
Okay.
is basically aligning the tracker with the north celestial pole around which the entire sky rotates, or south celestial pole if you live in the southern hemisphere,
That's which is what
which
we
is a
would
lot
have. That's
harder.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and yeah, so that alignment's pretty important because you know, otherwise, as you track, essentially, it's just going to get more and more off track as the
Yeah.
night goes on. And we've
So
got
essentially that's a calibration.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
It's basically it's telling the mount where it's pointed at so that it knows which direction it's supposed to be going in,
Yeah.
essentially. And you can compensate for imprecision there with things like auto guiding, which I can talk about if you like.
Yep.
And but yeah, it has to be accurate to a degree, otherwise you're just wasting your time. It's not going to track properly.
Okay. So basically from then you can then pick out the so you'll have coordinates, is that right? Is that how it works?
Yeah, well, okay, so it used to be pretty difficult when I was using this little mini mount here, I like to
Yeah.
call it, because it's quite simple mechanically. It'll track the sky. It's basically just like an on-off switch, and it has different speeds of tracking if you want to do time lapses and stuff. But it only has tracking and it only has sort of movement in one axis. So what that means is that you can't do go to commands, so you can't like program it to slew to this object and it'll find it. And so what I
Yep.
was having to do basically was like hold the telescope and kind of like manually line it up with where I thought the object was in the sky, which is
Yep.
impossible because you can't see most of these things with your eyes.
Yep.
They're just far too dim. And so that was a big challenge before I got a proper mount. And now the mount I've got is completely computerized, and I've got an app on my phone and on my computer, and I can basically just like I've got like a similar planetarium software in the app, and it shows like a kind of box of where the frame of the telescope is going to be pointing at. Um, and yeah, I can basically just line it up however I want, press go, and it will just lead straight
Yep.
to it, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. That's
So,
awesome.
so that saves me a lot of time now because I don't have
Yeah.
to, I was messing around for an hour each time, especially in the winter. It's so cold, and it's just you have to adjust the knobs with your hands, and it's just everything's freezing, and you can't move it properly, and it's just
Yeah.
yeah, it was terrible.
Well, that gives me a bit of a tangent question then. What is the best time
Yeah,
of year for you to do this kind of photography?
really tough to say honestly, because each season has its advantages basically. So the winter's got some really nice objects. You've got Orion. I don't know if do you get Orion down in the southern
I
hemisphere?
believe so, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got Orion. You've got a lot of the winter constellations are full of some really nice objects, photograph essentially, and also you you have the advantage of it getting darker way earlier. So you basically just have
Of
more
course.
time every
Yep.
night to shoot. So you'd have sort of 12, 13 hours instead of, I don't know, I get like 3 hours of proper darkness during the summer
Yeah.
at the worst point. So but the winter also has terrible weather here, so that kind of hinders that to
Yep.
some extent. So that's a big disadvantage of the winter. But and also, like I said, it's really cold, so it's kind of miserable to be setting up in the winter when it's like you can't even feel the knobs you're trying to twist and everything.
Yeah, but that's
Yeah,
pretty hard
um,
work.
yeah, and then the summer, like I said, it's dark for a much shorter period, but you also have the core of the Milky Way that starts rising, which is just unbeatable. You can't really,
Yeah.
there's no better part of the sky to photograph than that. And
Yep.
so,
Yep.
yeah, I'd say the summer in that respect is, um, I think I prefer summer. If
Yep.
you just go by, each sort of clear hour that you get, it's like I think a clear hour in summer is probably better than a clear hour in winter.
Fantastic. So let's talk photography here. So
Hmm.
when you've got everything aligned and you can see
Yeah,
exactly the subject that you are wanting to photograph,
yeah,
as photographers, we know all about, composing the shot and lining up the
yeah,
image and pushing the shutter,
mhm,
basically having your settings right and
yeah,
pushing the shutter. Clearly,
yeah,
it's a lot more complicated than that for what you're doing. Can you walk us
yeah.
through getting a shot?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so once I'm aligned and everything, and I picked a target, I've sort of splooned to the target. I generally start out by kind of doing a test exposure because essentially, yeah. So I'd probably better explain this better, but the way you go about taking a picture is by repeatedly taking super long exposures of the same object over and over again, and then you
Mhm.
stack them at the end to sort of cut out all the noise and light pollution and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's not unlike
And
doing
so
shots of the Milky Way and the Aurora and things like that. You can't, that's
exactly,
quite
yeah,
similar where you would do, or if you're doing star trails in particular. I mean, I know in
yeah,
your
yeah.
case, you're not doing star trails. The idea is
Well,
to
yeah, that's
not
what I'm
have
trying to
any
avoid it.
trailing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
But yeah, yeah, I'm sure
yeah,
most of our listeners understand
yeah, yeah.
doing multiple shots and then stacking them together.
Yeah, yeah, stacking, and it's the same as stuff like focus stacking in macro photography. You're basically just trying to get the best of each photo and cut out the unwanted noise. That's the general concept. And so obviously you want to start out by doing a test exposure because before you know, program an imaging run in and leave it to run all night, you want to make sure that you're actually getting the right results. And so yeah, generally I'll start off by doing a test exposure and making sure my focus is correct because that's pretty critical. You want to
Yep.
have exactly good focus. And sometimes I'll have to readjust that throughout the night as well because the temperature changes will actually change the shape of the lens to an extent where it'll actually change the focus, which is pretty
Wow.
annoying.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So
Yeah,
literally a difference in
yeah,
temperature will
yeah.
unfocus your shot.
Just make the lens expand, and then yeah,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
ruins the shot.
So
So
when you say a long exposure, what's your exposure
mhm,
time are we talking about here?
that varies a lot depending on the object. So
Okay.
for something bright like the Andromeda Galaxy that's behind you,
Yep.
or the Orion Nebula or something, the cores of those things are very bright, and you want to take care not to blow them out basically,
Yep.
and overexpose them. So but then at the same time you've got these sort of faint dust bands on the outer parts of the galaxy that you want to bring out in a lot of detail. And so sometimes I'll actually take several shots of varying exposures and then combine them at the end just to make sure I'll have one shot that's just sort of like the darker parts, and then the highlights are completely blown out, and then I'll
Yep.
do like an HDR, basically like a high
Yep.
dynamic range
Yeah, for sure.
composite
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. So essentially what you're
And
doing there is you're bracketing your exposures. So
yeah,
that's in photography speak, you're getting a series of exposures. So
yeah,
so let's use the image behind me as an example.
yeah,
And you may
yeah,
not know exactly, but ballpark, like an
yeah.
exposure time for what would be the longest exposure time you would need for that shot?
Okay, so the Andromeda Galaxy, if I recall correctly, I think I did like sort of 1 minute exposures to
Right.
for core detail, just
Yep.
because that's the kind of limit you can push it to without it getting blown out. And in fact, I think that was probably a bit too long because that shot is slightly blown out in the core,
Yep.
which is fine. It's just, an artistic thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did like 1 minute shots for the core there, and I think I did like 5 minute exposures for the outer parts, which is, that's way longer than most stuff you do in standard photography. Oh,
Definitely.
a battery issue here. Yeah. So yeah, 5 minutes, and it gets even longer for things like nebulae and stuff because they're
Yep.
just exceedingly fainter, and you have to go deeper and deeper each time.
Yeah, I mean, a 5 minute exposure is extremely long. Do you
Yeah.
find that pushes the limits of your gear, of your camera?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So obviously, the longer you're exposing for, the more demanding you have to be on the tracking because the slightest thing will just ruin an exposure. And the longer you're going for, the more chance there's going to be an error of some kind during that
Yep.
period, either mechanical or otherwise.
Yep.
Um, and so that's where I could talk a bit about auto guiding here because it's quite
Yes, please.
relevant. So yeah, so I mean, you'll see that in the shots of the telescope, but there's basically like a mini telescope on top of the main telescope with a mini camera on it. And that whilst the main telescope's running its images, that auto guider system will be continuously sort of taking shots and it'll track sort of stars in the field of view and make sure they're not moving too much. And if they do move around, it sort of sends corrective pulses to the mount to keep it back on track, which is pretty clever.
Fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
that's pretty essential for as soon as you start going past sort of 1 minute or so, and it also depends on how sort of high focal length, how high zoom the telescope you're using is, because obviously any errors kind of get exacerbated the more zoomed in you are. So
Yeah. Yeah, of
yeah,
course.
it becomes
So
pretty essential at a certain point.
yeah, for sure. So once
Yeah.
so how do you know when you've got all the exposures you need? Is it basically now just become, intuitive? You know because you've done it for so long, or is it a bit is there guesswork, or is it a bit more specific, a bit more
Um,
scientific than that?
yeah, I mean, you can kind of estimate how much total time you'll need on an object based on your own equipment and stuff. So I've sort of realized how much I've sort of got that in my head now. But ideally you want to get as much time as possible, and there is no exact, cut off time where you should stop. The more exposure time you get, the better. So generally I try to go for at least 3 hours on any object, but for the faint
Right.
stuff, it can quickly grow to sort of. I think the longest I've done so far is 11 hours or so, which is that's not a lot in terms of astrophotography. How long it can go. People go for 100 hours, 150 hours on the really faint
Really?
stuff. So yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it gets pretty extreme. So I haven't delved into
Yeah.
that kind of level yet, but we'll
Right.
do
I,
eventually, I
I
think.
see that in your future, Rudy. I think that's going.
Yeah.
um, Now, so are you just literally saving images directly to the memory card, and are you saving raw files, or are they JPEG files?
Yeah, okay. So I've got I've got a mini computer that's on board the telescope called an ASI Air, and it's like it's basically like a tiny little Windows computer essentially with an
Yep.
antenna, so I can control it remotely. Um, and that has a certain amount of memory on it. And so generally I'll just save the files directly to that, and then in the morning or whenever I'm done, because sometimes I'll leave the telescope out for several nights in a row. I'll just bring it inside and plug it into my laptop, and then transfer the files across. And yeah, they're technically raw files. They're saved in a kind of weird format called .fit, which is like an astronomy specific format. But for all intents and purposes, they're essentially raw files. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Which leads us to the post-processing stage.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you have you have particular software that then you load those files into for your stacking of images.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I use a plethora of different programs actually. So generally, I'll start off by I usually try and just save them to a folder. You know, I try and keep it quite organized. So I've got like an astrophotography folder with all the different objects I've done in it and which night it is, because sometimes I run it for several nights in a row. So I'll sort of bring the pictures into there, and then the first process is kind of stacking. So you there's several different programs you can use. You can even do it manually in Photoshop if you want, but that's incredibly tedious. So
Yeah.
I prefer to use specialized software for that. And so yeah, I'll stack the images, which is, you know, it's quite simple. It's basically just registration, which is the software will go through all the images and make sure they're aligned based on the star patterns that it can see. Because if you stack and they're not aligned, obviously it's just going to be horrible. So yeah, and then the stacking itself. So that can take quite a long time depending on how many images you're stacking. But I went out and bought a laptop with a pretty good GPU specifically for that purpose.
Yep.
So it gets done pretty quickly now. So then after the stacking, you essentially end up with your stacked kind of linear image, which actually looks quite dark because it hasn't been stretched at all. It's just like a kind of it's kind of like a raw file made out of all the raw files that you've stacked, is the way to
Right.
put it.
Yep.
And so the next process would be stretching it. So I bring that into another piece of software called Cyril, which is like an astronomy processing software essentially. And that can do plenty of stuff. It can do stacking as well, but I just prefer to use the other program called Deep Sky Stacker because that's what I'm used to. And yeah, so stretching it basically just you can do like an auto stretch on it and then fine tune it afterwards, which is what I tend to do. And then that's when you just kind of that's when you get your first glimpse at what you've actually captured and how you get like an idea of how good the final image is going to be.
Right. So then it's basically
Yeah.
you sort of then can do your tweaks to the image and put the Rudy
Hmm.
spin on it, right? And
Yeah.
just like all of us photographers do when we're out shooting digitally and we import our
Yeah.
photos into Lightroom or
Mhm.
Photoshop and we edit. So
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
it's
Exactly.
you basically putting your stamp on it and producing the image to taste, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So, you know, there's no perfect way to process an astrophotography image. I mean, there's there's just realistic ways of processing it and unrealistic ways of processing it. So I try to kind of keep it real, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I find a lot of people tend to um, boost the saturation so much and then fiddle with the colors to an extent where it's just not like
Yeah.
it's not real anymore. It's not a representation of what the data actually contains, basically.
Well, clearly that's not a
And
problem. It's
so,
just local to Australia, mate. It's
yeah,
we see it all the
yeah,
time, and we point it out a lot as well.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I try to stay truthful with it because you don't want to. First of all, you don't want to give people unrealistic expectations of what they're gonna see when they get into the hobby.
Yep.
And that's just something that has been a problem for ages in astronomy, you know, because you'll have magazines and books and stuff with Hubble photos on them and or articles. There's been a problem recently actually with uh things like supernova and stuff, where what you're actually going to see is like just a star brightening in the sky, becoming visible, basically. But then you have all these articles and stuff with either Hubble pictures of supernova or just straight up like AI images, and then
Right.
that gives people really unrealistic expectations of what they're going to see, and that kind of turns them off the hobby then because they go into it thinking they're going to see like a star exploding in the sky, and that
Yeah,
just
of
doesn't
course.
happen
Of
essentially.
course. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I try to keep it real, not give people unrealistic expectations, and then, but I will, saturate the image to some extent because, well, first of all, the way it comes out of the linear stacking process, everything's kind of condensed and kept to a minimum essentially. So you want to stretch it anyway and bring it out. So yeah,
Cool. What we might do is see if by the wonders of modern technologies, I'll share a screen,
yeah.
and regular listeners to the show know that this could be fraught with danger, but we'll give it a go. Um, we're going to throw up some photos onto the screen, and we're going to.
Yeah.
How does that look? Can you see that? All right.
Yeah, I can see that.
All right. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to get rid of that. Yeah. So that is my background, the Andromeda Galaxy, and so an image like that. Now you're telling me that that image is well, that galaxy is 1 million light years from Earth. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. That's about right.
Give or take
So,
a light year or
yeah.
two.
Give or take a few. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so essentially, what we're looking at there is light that has taken 1 million years to reach Earth. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a pretty interesting concept in astronomy, is that most of the light we're capturing has been traveling through space for quite a number of years. And so yeah, essentially you're seeing the Andromeda Galaxy as it was physically 1 million years ago,
Yeah. Which just get your
which is
head
pretty
around that,
nuts to
folks.
wrap your head around. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, exactly.
when I look at that image, and I mean the angle that the galaxy is on, that you've done that on
Yeah.
purpose to maximize the field of
Yeah.
view of the galaxy, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean obviously there's no up or down in space, so we can kind of
Yeah.
take liberties with how we want to frame stuff. But yeah, it just barely fit into the field of view of my sensor, so I had to kind of put it on the side
Yeah.
to fit it all in basically. And I mean, I think it adds an artistic touch to it as well. I don't
Well,
like pictures of it that are just like flat, because they're just
yeah, yeah. And you mentioned
it's a bit boring.
you use the word sensor there. Now I'm very familiar with the
Mm,
Nikon D5600. It's a great little camera, by the way.
yeah, yeah,
I
it's
always
excellent.
recommend that for people who are getting into landscape photography as well.
Hmm.
But it is
Yeah,
a cropped sensored SLR, so it's a
yeah,
APS-C size sensor.
yeah.
Does a full frame sensor make a big difference with astrophotography, or not really?
Um, yeah. So full frame sensors are they're kind of considered pretty premium in astrophotography, not just for the sensor itself, but also because you need a telescope that can produce a well-corrected image um, out to the corners of a full frame sensor, which is
Of course.
pretty demanding on the telescope. And so it's not the sensor itself that's costly; it's getting a telescope that can produce an image circle that wide
Yeah.
that's going to look good.
Yeah. So
Because
so
otherwise all
essentially
the stars just get
what you're saying there is a full frame sensor is so good, it'll
yeah,
show up flaws in any telescope.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So crop sensors, I'd say a full frame sensor is probably more coveted in like sort of wide field stuff like Milky Way and
Yeah, it is. That's right.
things like that with wide angle lenses. When it comes to telescopes, though, crop sensors are a lot more common and people don't mind using them that
Yeah.
much. So
Yep.
yeah, it's yeah,
All right. So let's flick over to another image here. So
yeah.
this is the Eastern Veil
Ah,
Nebula.
Eastern Veil Nebula, yeah.
Look at that thing.
I know it's freaky, isn't it? It looks like a
It,
alien head or something
yeah, it is. So
out in
so
space. Yeah.
tell the folks what are we actually looking at there? What is making the outline of that face, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting nebula. So it's part of a larger kind of nebula complex called the Veil Nebula. That's just the eastern part of it, essentially.
Wow.
And so that's what you're seeing there is basically gas from a supernova explosion. So when a star reaches the end of its life, it kind of grows, gets a lot cooler, and then it kind of implodes basically, and then just sends gas flying out into interstellar space for thousands of light years. So what you're seeing there is the gas from that star that exploded. I, I, I couldn't tell you how long ago it was, but definitely a while. Things take a while
Yep.
to move in space.
Yep.
And yeah, so that's just one small part of a massive supernova explosion, basically.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And the color that
Yeah.
I'm seeing there, is that Rudy color, or is that actually just what was there?
That's pretty accurate to the real color. I kept it pretty real on that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, so what you're seeing there, the sort of pinkish parts are H alpha gas or hydrogen gas, which gives off a pretty red pinkish hue.
Okay.
And this nebula is pretty interesting to do like narrowband photography on, where you separate out the different gas wavelengths, because it actually has a pretty different structure depending on which wavelength of light you're looking at in. So you can see the kind of hydrogen alpha part is almost like inside it, and then you've got this blue kind of shell around it of oxygen gas, which travels faster through space essentially, and so you get like
Wow.
this kind of cool separation of the colors. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
a pretty accurate representation of the color there.
So just to give us some perspective on what we're looking at here. So, and I know this is a bit tricky for people, but
Yeah.
here in Australia, we have, most people would know the Southern Cross that we can see here in Australia.
Hmm.
Um, if I was to take one of the stars of the Southern Cross, I mean, this nebula that I'm looking at here, are we looking at something around the same size in terms of what I see in the night sky, if that makes any sense? Just to give people
Uh,
an indication on how small this would be in our night sky, this area of the night sky that I'm looking at here on this photo.
yeah, so it's a God, yeah, that's tricky. It's a pretty small area of the sky.
Right.
So yeah, so for reference, the telescope I took this shot with was it's 420 millimeters of focal length
Okay.
on a crop sensor. So that gives
Yep.
you an idea of the kind of size of it. So it's it's if you're looking at kind of like the core of the Milky Way, it's probably like maybe a third of the length of the sort of width of the Milky Way, I guess, is
Yep.
one way I
Yep.
could put it. But yeah, pretty tight, small region of the sky there.
Yeah. And there's just, I mean, something like this nebula, like could you see it with a pair of binoculars, for example, or is it really just telescope?
Um, yeah, I think from a you'd have to be in a very dark sky site, so sort of
Right.
Audubon, I reckon,
Yeah.
if you wanted to have a chance of seeing it.
Yeah.
Now, what's tricky about this nebula specifically is that it happens to be in a very dense star field region in the Milky Way, and so you kind of even photographically you struggle to kind of pick it out from the stars around it. And so what I had to do here was actually an interesting processing technique where you kind of split out the stars in the nebula before you start processing and stretch them separately. And so you kind of bring out the nebula more than the stars that way to kind of reveal it. So
Gotcha.
yeah, I think you probably can see it. I've heard rumors of that floating around, but it would be very challenging. You'd have to
Yeah.
be in a very dark sky site.
Yeah.
Sure.
Brilliant. All right. Let's
Yeah.
have a look at another one. So
Yeah.
here we
Ooh,
have
that was one of my
Hunter's
favorites.
Sword. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, have I chosen well,
Yeah. So
Rudy?
yeah, you picked some of my best here, Brendan.
Yeah. Good.
Which is good. So yeah, so this is the famous Orion Nebula, which is I believe I think it's the second brightest nebula in the sky. You've got a brighter one down in the southern hemisphere. I can't see that unfortunately. So
Okay.
yeah, so this is the kind of jewel of the winter skies in Orion. Very bright. You can see it. You can see it with the naked eye from reasonably dark location. Just to kind of contrast that with the previous nebula we looked at. It's many hundreds of times brighter than that one. And so yeah, very good. I think most astrophotographers kind of start out with this as their first sort of target for deep sky astrophotography, because it's so simple. I mean, you can if you have a big enough Dobsonian and a smartphone, you can actually take pictures of the core of this. It's that bright.
Wow.
So it's yeah, and then when you go much deeper on it with much longer exposures, you can bring out all this kind of dust that's around it, which you can see in the image there, which is a lot fainter than the core itself. So yeah, for this one, I did actually have to do an HDR, like a high dynamic range composite, like for the Andromeda Galaxy, because the core is just so bright. It blows out pretty quickly. Even sort of 15-20 seconds is enough to overexpose it. So
Well,
it's
while
actually
you,
more it's pretty challenging as a target to photograph well, even if it's easy to kind of get a picture of it, of the core, because if you
yep.
want to bring all the dust and stuff out of it, you really have to combine several different exposure lengths to kind of bring out all of it at the same time properly.
Awesome. While we were talking,
Yeah.
I just did a quick Google search, and yes, we can see the
Yeah.
Orion Nebula from Australia. It's
Yeah.
telling me
Okay.
that it's pretty much
Awesome.
right on the celestial equator.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's for everyone to see, basically.
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
Sensational. That's so
Yeah.
cool. All right, so let's have a look at another
Excellent.
one.
Yeah.
So this is the North America Nebula. Wow.
Nebula. Yeah. Yeah. This one's not too far off from the Veil Nebula we saw a minute ago.
Yep.
In the sky. Obviously, in real life distance, it is pretty far.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the first out of the bunch so far that is in false color that we've seen. So this is not accurate to how you would see it in real life. It's what you call narrowband imaging. So you essentially kind of image several different wavelengths of gas that you can't necessarily see with the human eye. So yeah, one thing I should mention is that the camera I'm using is actually modified, so it lets in more of that infrared light that nebulae emit so much. So what you can see there is the kind of yellow color is that hydrogen alpha light, and then the blue would be oxygen. So it's a false color representation, but it does stay accurate to the different gases that are within the nebula. So it's not like an arbitrary random assignment of color. There is purpose behind it. So it's not.
Okay. So just the modification that's been made to your 5600, is that an IR filter that's been added to it?
Um, well, removed actually, so it
Sorry,
lets in
removed from it. Yes.
more of the IR light. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, so all kind of consumer DSLRs come with this IR cut filter that kind of sucks for astrophotography because it blocks out like 70% of that hydrogen light that you want to capture. So it was pretty challenging to do nebulae before I got that modification done, but it's worked out pretty well. I'm glad I went ahead with it because I was a bit worried that I'd end up ruining my camera because it's quite easy to sort of damage the sensor when you take the thing off. So I ended up sending it off to be modified by a pro instead of trying to do it myself because I just knew that was going to end in disaster.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so let's have a look. We've got another one here. So this is
I'm just going to put my phone on charge.
You're right, no worries. We can
battery.
That's fine. We can do that.
You can keep talking though. I'm just plugging the cable in. Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
Pleiades star cluster here.
Yeah, so also known as the Seven Sisters, yeah?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's right. Hang on a sec.
Now I'm almost certain that we can't see this one in the southern sky.
Yes, I think that would probably be one of the objects you can't see, unfortunately. Yeah, so this is one of our favorites up north, I guess.
Yep.
So it's I'd say this is probably one of the most well known out of the bunch, actually. More so than the Orion Nebula, because people spot this one all the time. You can see it from, the brightest city skies. You can see that collection of stars. People tend to think it's a constellation for some reason, but it's so small that you can't really consider it a constellation because it's just a tiny patch of the sky. So it's an open star cluster, and it's not just a star cluster though, because behind it there's all this interstellar gas that's basically being lit up by these young blue stars, and that's what really makes it interesting to me, is this kind of swirling interstellar dust that you can see behind it, and that's what a lot of people don't know is there when they're looking at the Pleiades, because you can't see that dust with the naked eye. It's just too faint. So all you can see is the stars themselves.
The thing that blows my mind about all your photos and astrophotography in general is they're bloody works of art, mate. Like you have a look at that. That is such an appealing scene, and to think,
I know.
what it actually really is. I mean, and it also says to me that it's just there's infinite possibilities when it comes to astrophotography as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
and to be able to produce something like that with a camera. It's just, yeah, it's absolutely
Yeah,
incredible.
it's pretty unbelievable that that just happens to be up there, and we're able to just capture that whenever we want, as long as it's clear. It's just it seems like, I mean, I don't want to get into creationism and all that, but it does seem like it's been kind of put together specifically to be photographed because it's just that good. And yeah, it's, you know, you look up in the night sky as well, and you don't realize that all that stuff's up there because it's too faint to see with the naked eye most of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, soon as you use a telescope, you just sort of reveal all this interstellar gas and dust and star clusters that are up there that you just would never see with the naked eye. But yeah,
It must be bloody addictive.
yeah, it really is. Yeah, and what you were saying about the infinite possibilities is true as well. So, when yeah, a lot of people tend to assume that there's only, well, they sort of ask like, what's the point of doing astrophotography? Because, and they do have a point. It's like you're basically photographing things that have been up there forever and will be up there forever in terms of, human lifespans, and that
Mm.
have been photographed plenty of times before. And so that's one of the interesting challenges when it comes to sort of doing the composition for one of these images, is like trying to get a unique kind of perspective on it when it's been photographed so many times. But to this day, people are still coming up with interesting ways to frame things, or timing them properly with celestial events like meteor showers and stuff. And so, yeah, you're right. There really are infinite possibilities, even though the sky itself is limited. So,
Yeah, we talk about this a lot on the channel as well. As you know, here in
yeah,
Australia, we're blessed. We've got lots of great landscapes to photograph and great night skies as
yeah,
well. But it's always is that challenge of any time you go to a landscape location, particularly a famous one, and we've got plenty of those here in
hmm,
Australia. It's trying to
yeah,
put your own stamp on it and your own creativity on it. And it's exactly the
yeah,
same with what you're doing. I just think I mean, it's just so much more technical what you're doing because, like you alluded
yeah,
to before, like a shot like this that we're looking at now, you could set up for that shot, you know what the shot you're after, and then you have a
yeah,
minor little hiccup with something, and that's,
yeah.
is it kind of like you got to start again, or do you sort of work with what you get anyway?
Well, I mean, some things will always go wrong, and they quite often go wrong in
Yep.
astrophotography because like you said, you're juggling so many kind of technical aspects that all it takes is for one thing to
Yeah.
not work quite right, and so, I mean, in terms of starting again, you can always reuse data that you've captured later on. So that's not a problem. But if you'll quite often get a night of imaging kind of ruined because I mean, the most common thing is just you set up and then clouds roll in. That's just
Of course.
that happens loads of times.
Yeah.
Or it'll be like a cloud that's gone to cover up the specific part of the sky you're trying to photograph as well,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
for
none of the
sure.
rest of it, which is annoying. So it can be weather related issues like that. It can be equipment related. Like you'll have you'll sort of, because the way I do it is I sort of, once I've taken my test exposures and I know everything's running properly, I will go to bed and let it run because
Of course.
there's no point staying up until 5 in the morning to
Yeah.
just to watch it run. And so, but all it takes is for the guiding to bugger up once, and then it'll just
Yeah.
that just throws everything off basically. So
Yeah. Um,
equipment related, weather related, planes flying in front of the object you're trying to shoot,
how rude.
satellites, it could be all, yeah, it is pretty rude,
Yeah.
so it could be all manner of stuff that bugs it up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've sort of gotten my set up to a point now where it does run pretty smoothly, talking technically, night after night without many issues. So it'll be weather and stuff that
Yeah.
usually throws it off. So,
And just getting back to the
yeah.
equipment side of things, battery operated, or do you have to have mains power connection for this?
Yeah, so the the majority of it is mains power. So most notably the mount, which takes the most power to run because
Right.
it's pretty high torque. You're trying to move this pretty heavy payload around. But my camera itself is still battery operated, and that's something I really need to change because it's getting ridiculous. But I do
Yeah.
actually have to charge up several batteries and stuff, and I've sort of I've coped with it all right because I can just quietly slip out and put a battery in it, and it'll run for sort of 3 or 4 hours on the batteries I put in it, which is fine.
Yeah.
And yeah, but the rest of it is fully mains power. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So where do you see yourself going with this, Rudy? Are you interested in getting into some kind of career to do with this sort of stuff, or is it more just going to be a continuation of a hobby? Or
Yeah, I'm not really sure to be honest. I mean, I can see myself keeping it as a hobby forevermore, but I'd also like to expand on it, and I mean, I've been trying to grow my following on social media for it for quite some time now.
yeah,
And recently I've started delving into stuff like prints, which you've seen.
yeah,
So there's definitely ways to kind of make it self-sustaining where I can make some money with it that I can then put back into equipment and stuff.
of course.
um One way to do that is prints. You can offer, I have thought about starting a YouTube channel to do with it, where I explain equipment or
Yeah,
processing, or there's so much I could talk about. But yeah, and in terms of a career, it's quite difficult to make a career out of astrophotography because you have
yeah,
to be, like I said, you have to separate yourself from the thousands of images that people have already taken of the same objects and stuff. So yeah, we'll see how it evolves. I mean, I'm still adding to my equipment and stuff. I'm still working and saving up and buying new gear. So
which leads me to my next question.
yeah.
In terms of equipment, what are you looking at? What's the next thing
The
that you're
next
after?
thing, okay. So recently, in the last few days, in fact, I've been looking for a new telescope because my current scope, and I'm just talking about the actual scope itself here, not the mount and the guide scope and all that. That's still going to stay the same. So, but yeah, the scope itself, I've been using what's called a doublet refractor. So it has like two optical elements in it essentially, and then a field flattener, and it's just optically, it's all right. I'm looking for something a bit sharper basically. So I might
Okay.
upgrade to like a triplet or a quadruplet. Yeah, something a little bit higher end. And then, I mean, the good thing is, I can sell off the equipment I've already had. I'm replacing once I get something new, so I can save a lot that way.
Yeah.
And also get stuff secondhand because a telescope doesn't get used essentially. Like you don't. It's not like a camera where after a certain number of shutter clicks, it sort of starts degrading. It's just it doesn't degrade like that
Yeah.
essentially. So
Yeah.
yeah, new scope, and then I'm also looking at getting a new camera actually. So you can use DSLRs and stuff, but people make these sort of dedicated astronomy cameras with cooling fans on them and stuff, which is quite important in the summer because
Yep.
it eliminates a lot of that thermal noise you get um, in high temperatures. And yeah, so I'm probably going to switch to an astronomy camera soon, and then I'll keep this one obviously for Milky Way and stuff because
Yep.
that's far more convenient, to put on a tripod and everything. The astronomy cameras are really kind of, you have to plug it into the computer and run it remotely, and there's no buttons on it or anything. So
Right.
yeah, scope and
Okay.
camera are my next big pieces of equipment I'm gonna get, I think.
Well, that's awesome. If you would like to help
Yeah,
Rudy out on his adventure in
yeah,
astrophotography, we have a link below where you can head over and check out his prints that you can order. I'm
mhm.
assuming you can ship them out to Australia or anywhere in the world for that
Yeah,
matter,
yeah. There's
Rudy.
worldwide shipping, absolutely. Yeah,
Fantastic. So as I say, that'll be
anywhere
linked
in the
below.
world.
And
Yeah.
please, by all means, jump on Rudy's Instagram and have a look.
Hmm.
Got quite a few images there, and he's adding to it all the time with his new work.
Yeah,
And
posting regularly.
yeah, it's an absolute credit to you, Rudy, and to see a young guy who's so keen on what he does, but more importantly, producing such fantastic imagery.
Mhm.
Yeah, it blows my mind to think about what you're actually doing, and I wouldn't know the first thing about it. So I really do
Yeah,
appreciate you jumping on the channel and shedding a bit of light
yeah,
on
absolutely.
this for everyone. I hope you've enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, it's been super fun. It's the first time I've got to do something like this, so I've
Well,
enjoyed
that's
it.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Cheers,
all of
Brendan.
our loyal listeners can be early adopters of Rudy's work and jump over to his Instagram and check it
Mhm.
all out.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, mate, and all the best to you.
Yeah.
No doubt you and I will cross paths at somewhere in the future, and
Yeah.
I might send the kids over to visit you at some point. So that'd be cool too.
Yeah.
uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So
Sounds good.
we really appreciate your time, Rudy. Thanks for joining us on the Down South Photo
Yeah.
Show.
Absolutely.
Well, there you have it, folks. A very interesting interview with young Rudy. It's pretty clear that his passion comes across for what he does. Um, Quite amazing. Only 17 years of age and that much into deep space photography and producing images like that, which is pretty cool. If you've got any questions for Rudy, you can leave them in the comments below. I'll make sure that he gets them. Or you can hit him up on Instagram at rudy.astro, which is all linked below as well. And if you feel that way inclined, you like what you see, I've also linked below where you can go and order yourself a print or two of Rudy's work. But yeah, by all means, follow him along on Instagram. Check out what he's up to. He is posting photos quite regularly now of his deep space exploits. So there it is. That has been episode 130 of the Down South Photo Show. We'll return to our regularly scheduled programming next week, hopefully with Mr. Blake on the other screen. Maybe. Who knows? We'll see how we go. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We will see you next week. Bye for now.